Chapter 1. A Humble Beginning. Mao Zedong was born on December 26, 1893, in a small village called Shaoshan, nestled in the rolling hills of Hunan Province, China. Life in Shaoshan was simple, but it was also filled with hardship. Mao's family lived in a modest home surrounded by fields where they grew rice and vegetables. His parents were farmers, working from dawn until dusk to provide for their children. Every day was a struggle to make ends meet. The land was not always kind, and when the harvest was poor, the family had little to eat. Little Mao, as he was known, often helped his parents in the fields. He learned early on the value of hard work, of perseverance. But even as he labored in the dirt, his mind was elsewhere. Mao loved learning. He was curious about the world beyond his village, about the stories and ideas that filled the pages of the books he managed to find. Books became his escape, his way of seeing beyond the narrow life that his village offered. Mao's father, a strict and traditional man, had a clear plan for his son's future. He wanted Mao to follow in his footsteps, to become a farmer, to work the land, and to continue the family's way of life. But Mao had other dreams. He wanted to do something more, something that would make a difference in the world. He read about heroes from Chinese history, about emperors, generals, and scholars who had shaped the destiny of the nation. He imagined himself as one of them, a leader who could bring change. When Mao was 13, his father arranged for him to marry a local girl, as was the custom. But Mao, determined to chart his own course, refused to accept the marriage. This decision created tension between him and his father, but it also marked the beginning of Mao's journey towards independence, a journey that would eventually take him far from the fields of Shaoshan. At the age of 17, Mao left his village and traveled to Changsha, the capital of Hunan Province. This was no small step. For a boy from a small village, the city was vast, bustling, and full of new possibilities. In Changsha, Mao enrolled in a new type of school, one that focused on modern subjects like science and mathematics, rather than the traditional Confucian classics. It was in Changsha that Mao was first exposed to the winds of change sweeping through China, a country in turmoil. China, at the time, was a land of deep contrasts. On one hand, there were ancient traditions and a rigid social hierarchy. On the other, there were new ideas about democracy, freedom, and equality. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled China for over 2 centuries, had just fallen. The country was now a republic, but it was weak and divided. Warlords controlled different regions, and foreign powers had carved out spheres of influence. The people were suffering under the weight of poverty, corruption, and oppression. As a young student in Changsha, Mao was deeply affected by the political and social unrest around him. He joined student groups, attended protests, and read everything he could about the ideas that were shaking the world, ideas like democracy, socialism, and Marxism. He was particularly drawn to Marxism, a theory developed by Karl Marx that spoke of a world where the working class would rise up against their oppressors and create a society where everyone was equal. Mao's time in Changsha was transformative. He began to see himself not just as a student, but as part of a larger movement for change. He wanted to fight for the poor and the oppressed, for people like his own family who had struggled for generations with little hope of a better life. But how could he, a young man from a small village, make a difference in such a vast and troubled land? Mao found his answer in activism. He started to organize other students and young people, spreading the ideas of revolution. He wrote articles for local newspapers arguing that China needed a new kind of government, one that would serve the people, not just the rich and powerful. He spoke passionately about the need for change, about the need to overthrow the old ways and build a new, fairer society. It was during this time that Mao first encountered the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. The CCP was a small and secretive group at first, but they shared Mao's belief that Marxism could offer a solution to China's problems. The communists believed that a revolution led by the working class could transform China, could free it from the grip of warlords, foreign powers, and corrupt officials. This idea resonated deeply with Mao. He joined the party and quickly became one of its most dedicated members. Mao's journey from a small village to the political heart of China had begun, but it was not an easy path. There were many obstacles ahead, many dangers. The Chinese Communist Party was seen as a threat by the ruling powers, and its members were often hunted, arrested, and even killed. But Mao was undeterred. He believed in the cause, believed that the suffering of the people gave them the right to rise up, to demand a better life. In the years that followed, Mao traveled across China, spreading the message of revolution. He went to the countryside, where he lived among the peasants, listening to their stories of hardship and teaching them about Marxism. Mao understood that the peasants were the key to the revolution. They were the majority of China's population, and their support would be crucial in the struggle ahead. Mao's ability to connect with the peasants, to speak their language and share their struggles, set him apart from other communist leaders. He was not just a theorist. He was a man of action, someone who was willing to go to the most remote and difficult places to spread the message of revolution. The peasants began to see Mao as one of their own, a leader who truly understood their pain and their hopes. As the years went by, Mao's influence within the Communist Party grew. He became known as a strategist, a leader who could inspire people and bring them together. But he also became known for his determination, his willingness to take risks, and his belief in the power of the people to shape their own destiny. Mao Zedong's early years were marked by hardship, learning, and a growing awareness of the world's injustices. From the fields of Shaoshan to the streets of Changsha, Mao's journey was one of self-discovery and growing conviction. He had seen the suffering of his people and had vowed to fight for a better China. But this was just the beginning of his story. The road ahead was filled with challenges, battles, and difficult choices. Choices that would shape the future of China and the world. Chapter 2. The Awakening. In the bustling city of Changsha, young Mao Zedong's world began to expand. It was here, in this vibrant and chaotic environment, that Mao encountered new ideas that would change the course of his life and the history of China. Mao was a curious student, eager to learn about the world beyond the rural life he had known in Shaoshan. The school he attended in Changsha was unlike anything he had experienced before. It was a place where the old ways were being challenged by new ideas that came from distant lands and promised change. Mao was fascinated by what he learned. He read voraciously about the French Revolution, where common people rose up against their king, about the American Revolution, where colonies broke free from a powerful empire, and about a new idea called Marxism, which spoke of a world where the poor and oppressed could rise up and create a society where everyone was equal. These ideas stirred something deep within Mao. He began to see the world in a new light. China, at that time, was a country in crisis. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled for centuries, had been overthrown, but the new republic that replaced it was weak and unstable. Warlords controlled different parts of the country, each ruling their territories with brutality and greed. Foreign powers also had a strong presence in China, exploiting the country's resources and people. The Chinese people were suffering. Poverty, hunger, and injustice were everywhere. Mao saw this suffering up close. He saw the desperation in the faces of the poor, the cruelty of the warlords, and the arrogance of the foreign powers. He began to ask himself, why should it be this way? Why should so many suffer while so few live in luxury? The more he thought about it, the more he became convinced that something had to change. It was during this time that Mao became involved in student protests. These were not just ordinary protests. They were filled with anger and hope, with a desire to break free from the chains of the past. Mao joined other young people who were tired of the old ways, tired of the corruption and injustice that seemed to dominate their lives. They wanted a new China, a China that would be strong, independent, and fair. Mao quickly emerged as a leader among these students. He was passionate and persuasive. He had a way of speaking that made people listen, that made them believe that change was possible. He began to organize meetings where students would gather to discuss the problems facing China and what could be done about them. They talked about revolution, about the need to overthrow the old order and create a new society based on equality and justice. Mao's interest in Marxism grew during this period. Marxism, with its promise of a classless society where the workers and peasants would rise up and take control, seemed to offer a solution to the problems he saw in China. He read the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, trying to understand how these ideas could be applied to China's unique situation. He saw in Marxism a way to unite the people of China, to bring them together in a common cause against their oppressors. But Mao also realized that revolution would not be easy. The forces of the old order were strong, and they would not give up their power without a fight. The warlords had armies, the foreign powers had money and influence, and even within China there were those who feared change. But Mao believed that the power of the people was greater than any army or any amount of money. He believed that if the people were united, if they were willing to fight for their rights, they could overcome any obstacle. Mao's conviction only grew stronger as he saw the continued suffering of the Chinese people. He traveled to the countryside, where he met with peasants who lived in extreme poverty, working hard every day just to survive. These encounters had a profound effect on him. He realized that the peasants, who made up the majority of China's population, were the key to any successful revolution. If they could be organized, if they could be convinced to join the struggle, then the revolution could succeed. Mao began to focus his efforts on reaching out to the peasants. He spent time in the villages, talking to them about their lives, listening to their stories of hardship. He spoke to them about Marxism, about the possibility of a new China where they would no longer be oppressed. At first, many of the peasants were skeptical. They had heard promises before, and nothing had changed. But Mao's sincerity and passion began to win them over. They could see that he was different from the other leaders they had known. He understood their suffering because he had lived it himself. As Mao's influence grew, so did his determination to bring about change. He knew that the path ahead would be difficult, that there would be many battles to fight, many sacrifices to be made. But he also knew that the cause was just, that the suffering of the people gave them the right to rise up, to demand a better life. Mao continued to organize and educate, spreading the message of revolution wherever he went. He knew that he could not do it alone, that the success of the revolution depended on the support of the masses. He worked tirelessly to build that support, to bring together students, workers, and peasants in a united front against the forces of oppression. The seeds of revolution had been planted, and Mao was ready to lead the charge. He believed that a new China was possible, a China where everyone would be equal, where the people would have control over their own lives. But he also knew that this dream would not be achieved without struggle. The old order would not fall easily, and there would be many who would resist the changes he sought to bring. As Mao looked out over the vast countryside of China, he knew that the road ahead would be long and hard, but he was determined to see it through, to fight for a China that was free from the chains of the past. This was his awakening, the moment when he realized that his life's purpose was to fight for the revolution, to lead his people to a better future. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers and challenges, but Mao was ready. He had found his cause, and he was prepared to dedicate his life to it. The revolution had begun, and there was no turning back. Before we dive into Chapter 3, we want to remind you that you're listening to this story on Woo English. If you're enjoying this journey into the life of Mao Zedong, don't forget to share it with your friends. Your comments and likes mean a lot to us, so please take a moment to let us know what you think. Now, let's continue with Chapter 3. Chapter 3, Joining the Chinese Communist Party. In the year 1921, China was a nation in turmoil. The Qing dynasty had fallen, and in its place, the country was fractured into regions controlled by powerful warlords. These warlords ruled their territories with an iron fist, caring little for the suffering of the common people. Foreign powers, too, had a strong presence in China, exploiting its resources and people for their own gain. Poverty, hunger, and oppression were everywhere. It was in this chaotic environment that Mao Zedong found his calling, and it was in 1921 that his journey took a significant turn. That year, Mao Zedong became one of the founding members of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. The CCP was a small group at first, just a handful of men who shared a common vision. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in ambition. These men had big ideas that would change the course of Chinese history. The Chinese Communist Party was inspired by the teachings of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. They believed that China's problems could only be solved through revolution, a revolution that would overthrow the warlords, end foreign domination, and create a socialist state where all people were equal. Mao was excited. He had found his life's purpose. The ideas of Marxism, which he had studied so passionately, now had a vehicle through which they could be realized. Mao threw himself into the work of the Communist Party with all the energy and passion he could muster. He knew that the task before them was enormous. The warlords were powerful, the foreign powers were entrenched, and the Chinese people were weary after years of suffering. But Mao believed that if they could win the support of the people, especially the peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, they could succeed. The peasants were the backbone of China, working the land from sunrise to sunset, barely able to feed their families with the fruits of their labor. They were heavily taxed, oppressed by landlords, and often forced to live in dire poverty. Mao understood their pain. He had grown up in a poor farming family himself, and he knew what it was like to struggle for survival. He believed that the peasants were the key to the revolution. If they could be organized, if they could be shown that a better life was possible, they could become the driving force behind the communist movement. Mao began traveling around China, visiting villages and towns, speaking to the peasants about their struggles and about the possibility of change. He listened to their stories of hardship, of how they were mistreated by landlords and warlords, of how they barely had enough to eat. Mao spoke to them in simple, direct language, explaining the ideas of Marxism in a way that they could understand. He told them that they didn't have to accept their lot in life, that they could rise up and take control of their own destiny. At first, many of the peasants were skeptical. They had heard promises before, and nothing had changed. But Mao's sincerity and passion began to win them over. He didn't just talk about revolution. He lived among them, sharing their hardships, working in the fields alongside them, eating the same simple meals. The peasants began to see Mao not just as a leader, but as one of their own, someone who truly understood their suffering and who was committed to helping them achieve a better life. Mao's efforts to organize the peasants were not without challenges. The warlords who controlled the countryside were ruthless, and they did not hesitate to use violence to maintain their power. Mao and his fellow communists were often hunted, arrested, and even killed. But Mao was undeterred. He believed that the cause was just, and that the suffering of the people gave them the right to rise up against their oppressors. Mao's dedication to the cause began to pay off. Slowly but surely, more and more peasants began to join the communist movement. They formed local committees where they would discuss their grievances and plan for the future. They began to organize strikes and protests, demanding better conditions and the redistribution of land. Mao encouraged them to stand up for their rights, to fight back against the landlords and warlords who had oppressed them for so long. As the communist movement grew, so did Mao's influence within the party. He became known as a leader who was deeply connected to the people, someone who was not afraid to get his hands dirty, who understood the realities of life in rural China. Mao's strategy of focusing on the peasants set him apart from other communist leaders, who were often more focused on organizing the urban working class. Mao believed that the true strength of the revolution lay in the countryside, among the millions of peasants who toiled in the fields. By the late 1920s, Mao had become one of the most prominent leaders of the Communist Party. But the road ahead was still filled with challenges. The Nationalist Party, or Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, was determined to crush the communist movement. In 1927, Chiang launched a brutal campaign against the communists, killing thousands of party members and forcing the survivors to flee to the countryside. This was a dark time for the Communist Party, but Mao remained steadfast. He believed that the struggle was far from over, that the revolution would continue, even in the face of such terrible setbacks. Mao and his followers retreated to the remote mountains of Jiangxi province, where they began to rebuild their strength. It was here that Mao began to develop his strategy of guerrilla warfare, a strategy that would become a key part of the communist victory in the years to come. Mao's experiences during this time only strengthened his belief in the power of the peasants. He saw how they could be organized, how they could fight back against seemingly insurmountable odds. He saw how their support could be the foundation of a new, revolutionary China. As the years went by, Mao continued to refine his ideas and his strategies. He knew that the path to revolution would be long and difficult, but he also knew that the stakes were too high to turn back. The suffering of the Chinese people, the oppression they faced, demanded action, and Mao was determined to be the leader who would bring about the change they so desperately needed. The Chinese Communist Party was still small, still fighting for survival in a hostile environment. But Mao had a vision of a China that was free from the tyranny of warlords and foreign powers, a China where the people had control over their own lives. It was a vision that would drive him for the rest of his life, through the many battles and challenges that lay ahead. In 1921, Mao Zedong joined a small group of revolutionaries with big ideas that would one day change the face of China. He had found his life's purpose, and he was ready to dedicate everything to the cause. The road to revolution was long and filled with obstacles, but Mao was prepared to face whatever challenges came his way. The struggle had only just begun, and Mao was ready to lead the charge. Chapter 4: The Long March. In 1934, the Chinese Communist Party faced its darkest hour. The Nationalist Party, led by the determined and ruthless Chiang Kai-shek, was closing in. For years, the Communists had built a stronghold in Jiangxi province, deep in the mountains. Here, they had established a government, trained an army, and gained the support of the local peasants. But the Nationalists were relentless. They launched a series of campaigns to encircle and destroy the Communists, cutting off their supplies and attacking them from all sides. The situation grew desperate. It seemed that the revolution might be crushed before it could truly begin. Mao Zedong, who had become one of the key leaders of the Communist Party, knew that they had to make a bold move to survive. The decision was made. The Communists would abandon their base in Jiangxi and embark on a daring retreat, a retreat that would later be known as the Long March. This was no ordinary retreat. It was a journey of over 6,000 miles through some of the most difficult and dangerous terrain in China. The Communists would have to cross high mountains, wide rivers, and vast deserts, all while being pursued by the nationalist forces. The Long March began in October 1934. About 86,000 soldiers and followers of the Communist Party set out on this perilous journey, carrying with them whatever they could manage. The conditions were brutal. They had little food, and what they had was often spoiled or insufficient. The cold was biting, especially as they climbed high into the mountains. Many fell ill, and there were few supplies to treat them. Hunger and exhaustion took their toll, and the constant threat of nationalist attacks loomed over them. Every day was a struggle to survive. Despite these challenges, Mao Zedong remained resolute. He understood that this was more than just a retreat. It was a test of the Communist Party's resilience, its ability to endure the hardest trials and emerge stronger. Mao's leadership during the Long March was critical. He made difficult decisions, often moving the group through treacherous terrain to avoid enemy forces. He inspired his followers with his determination, his belief that they could overcome any obstacle if they remained united and focused on their goal. The Long March was not just a physical journey. It was also a journey of the spirit. Along the way, Mao and the other communist leaders continued to spread their revolutionary ideas. They spoke to the peasants they encountered, sharing their vision of a new China where the poor would no longer be oppressed, where everyone would have a fair share of the nation's wealth. They promised a future free from the tyranny of warlords and foreign powers. Many of the peasants they met were moved by these ideas. They saw in the communists a group of leaders who truly cared about their plight, who were willing to endure great suffering for the sake of the people. But the suffering was immense. Thousands died during the Long March, some from hunger, others from the freezing cold, and many more in battles with the nationalists. There were moments when it seemed the communists might not survive. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, they pushed on. Every step forward was a victory, a testament to their determination and resolve. The Long March became a symbol of the Communist Party's resilience, a story that would inspire generations of revolutionaries. One of the most famous episodes of the Long March was the crossing of the Looting Bridge. This ancient suspension bridge, made of wooden planks and iron chains, spanned the Dadu River. On the other side waited a large force of nationalist troops determined to stop the communists from crossing. The bridge itself was a death trap. The planks had been removed, leaving only the chains, and the nationalists had set up machine guns on the other side, ready to cut down anyone who tried to cross. Mao knew that crossing the Looting Bridge was crucial. If they could not cross, the entire march would be in jeopardy. A group of brave soldiers volunteered to lead the charge. They crawled across the chains, under heavy fire, with nothing but the roaring river below them. One by one they made it across, and with incredible courage they fought off the nationalists and secured the bridge. This victory was a turning point in the Long March. It showed that the communists could overcome even the most impossible challenges. As the months passed, the ranks of the communists thinned. Many had died, and many more had been separated from the main group. But those who remained were the most determined, the most loyal to the cause. Mao Zedong had emerged as the undisputed leader of the Communist Party during this time. His strategic thinking, his ability to inspire his followers, and his unyielding commitment to the revolution had earned him the respect and loyalty of the survivors. After over a year on the march, in October 1935, the Communists finally reached the remote region of Yan'an in northern China. Only about 8,000 of the original 86,000 had made it. The survivors were exhausted, but they were also filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Yan'an would become the new base of the communist movement, a place where they could regroup, train new soldiers, and continue the fight for the revolution. The Long March was more than just a military retreat. It was a journey that transformed the Chinese Communist Party. It forged a new identity for the party, one built on resilience, sacrifice, and a deep connection with the people. The stories of the Long March would be told and retold, becoming a central part of the communist narrative. It was during this time that Mao solidified his leadership, not just through his strategies, but through his ability to endure hardship alongside his followers. For Mao Zedong, the Long March was a defining moment. It was a time of incredible suffering, but also a time of incredible growth. He had led his followers through one of the most difficult challenges imaginable and had emerged stronger for it. The Long March became a symbol of hope for the communist movement, a testament to the idea that no matter how difficult the struggle, victory was possible if one had the courage to persevere. The journey to Yan'an was the end of one chapter, but it was also the beginning of another. The communists had survived, but their struggle was far from over. The years ahead would bring new challenges, new battles, and new opportunities. But the Long March had shown that Mao and his followers were ready to face whatever came next, with the same determination and courage that had carried them through the mountains, rivers, and deserts of China. Chapter 5. The War Against Japan. In 1937, China was once again plunged into chaos. This time, the chaos came not from within, but from beyond its borders. Japan, a rising military power in Asia, launched a full-scale invasion of China. The Japanese forces were brutal and relentless, sweeping across the country with devastating speed. Cities fell one after another. The horrors of war spread rapidly, and the Chinese people suffered immensely. The invasion brought together two bitter enemies, the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists, led by Mao Zedong. For years, the nationalists and communists had fought each other in a brutal civil war. The two sides had very different visions for China's future. The nationalists wanted to build a strong, centralized government, while the communists sought to create a socialist state where the power would lie in the hands of the people. The differences between them were deep, and the hatred ran strong. But the Japanese invasion forced them into an uneasy alliance. They knew that if they did not unite against this common enemy, China would be lost. Mao Zedong saw this war as more than just a struggle for national survival. He saw it as an opportunity to strengthen the communist forces and expand their influence throughout China. The nationalists, with their larger army, would bear the brunt of the fighting, while the communists could focus on consolidating their power in the areas they controlled. Mao's strategy was clear. He would use the war to his advantage, preparing for the eventual showdown with the nationalists that he knew was inevitable. In the areas under communist control, Mao began to implement policies that would win the hearts and minds of the people. He understood that the support of the people was the key to victory. Without it, the revolution would fail. Mao introduced land reforms, a policy that was especially popular among the peasants. The communists redistributed land from the landlords to the poor farmers, giving them a sense of ownership and hope for a better future. For many peasants, this was the first time they had ever owned the land they worked on. It was a revolutionary change, and it deeply impressed them. But Mao didn't stop at land reform. He knew that education and healthcare were also crucial to winning the people's loyalty. In the areas controlled by the communists, schools were established to teach literacy and basic skills. This was a time when many people in rural China were illiterate. The ability to read and write opened up new possibilities for them. It was not just about education. It was about empowerment. People began to see that the communists were offering them something tangible, something that could improve their lives. Healthcare was another focus of Mao's policies. In the war-torn countryside, disease was rampant, and medical care was scarce. The communists set up clinics and trained barefoot doctors who could provide basic medical care to the peasants. These barefoot doctors were not fully qualified physicians, but they were trained to treat common illnesses, prevent the spread of disease, and educate the people about hygiene and health. For many peasants, this was their first experience with organized healthcare, and it left a lasting impression. As these reforms took root, the people began to see the communists as different from the nationalists. The nationalists were often seen as corrupt, distant, and uncaring about the plight of the common people. In contrast, the communists were seen as being close to the people, understanding their needs, and working to improve their lives. Mao's strategy was working. The support for the Communist Party grew stronger, and more people began to see Mao as a leader who truly cared about them. Meanwhile, the war against Japan raged on. The nationalist forces, despite their size, struggled to contain the Japanese advance. The war took a heavy toll on them, both in terms of manpower and resources. The Japanese occupation was brutal, with atrocities committed against civilians and widespread destruction of cities and villages. But while the nationalists were engaged in intense battles with the Japanese, Mao's forces were growing stronger in the countryside. Mao's decision to focus on guerrilla warfare proved to be highly effective. The communist forces, known as the Eighth Route Army, used hit-and-run tactics to harass the Japanese troops, attacking their supply lines and communication networks. These tactics were not designed to win major battles, but to wear down the enemy over time. It was a strategy of endurance, one that suited the strengths of the communist forces. The Japanese were frustrated by their inability to crush the communist resistance. The rugged terrain of northern China, combined with the support of the local population, made it difficult for the Japanese to fully control the areas where the communists operated. Mao's strategy of guerrilla warfare allowed the communist forces to survive and even thrive, despite the overwhelming strength of the Japanese military. As the war dragged on, the alliance between the nationalists and communists began to fray. The distrust between the two sides never truly disappeared, and both were preparing for the day when they would turn their guns on each other once again. Mao knew that the real struggle would come after the Japanese were defeated. He was biding his time, building his strength, and waiting for the right moment. By the time Japan surrendered in 1945, Mao's forces had grown significantly. The Communist Party had not only survived the war, but had emerged stronger, with greater support from the Chinese people. The reforms that Mao had implemented during the war had won him the loyalty of millions of peasants, who now saw the Communist Party as the true defender of their interests. The end of the war brought new challenges, but it also brought new opportunities. The defeat of Japan left a power vacuum in China, and the stage was set for the final showdown between the nationalists and the communists. Mao was ready. He had used the war to strengthen his position, and he was now in a much stronger position to challenge the nationalists for control of China. The war against Japan had been a time of great suffering for the Chinese people, but it had also been a time of transformation for the Communist Party. Mao Zedong had emerged from the war not just as a survivor, but as a leader who was ready to take on the challenge of building a new China. The war had taught him valuable lessons about leadership, strategy, and the importance of winning the support of the people. These lessons would guide him in the years to come as he prepared for the next phase of the Chinese Revolution. The war was over, but the revolution was far from complete. Mao knew that the hardest battles were still ahead, but he was ready to face them with the same determination and resolve that had carried him through the darkest days of the war. The road to victory would be long and difficult, but Mao believed that the people were with him, and that together they could build a new China, free from oppression and filled with hope for the future. Chapter 6. The Civil War Resumes. The year was 1945. World War II had just ended, and with it, Japan's occupation of China came to an abrupt halt. The Chinese people, exhausted from years of conflict, hoped for peace. But peace was not to come. The fragile alliance between the Chinese Communists, led by Mao Zedong, and the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek quickly unraveled. The two sides had always been uneasy partners, brought together only by the common enemy of Japan. With that enemy defeated, their deep-seated differences resurfaced, and the Civil War, which had been paused by the Japanese invasion, resumed with renewed intensity. Mao Zedong had been preparing for this moment. During the war against Japan, the Communists had used the time to strengthen their forces and expand their influence. Mao had learned valuable lessons in leadership, strategy, and the importance of winning the support of the people. Now, as the Civil War reignited, he was ready to put those lessons to use. The nationalists, with their larger and better-equipped army, initially had the upper hand. They controlled the major cities and much of the infrastructure. But Mao was not deterred. He knew that the nationalists' strength was also their weakness. Their large, conventional forces were tied down defending fixed positions, while Mao's forces, hardened by years of guerrilla warfare, were mobile, flexible, and deeply rooted in the countryside. Mao's strategy was clear. Avoid direct confrontation with the nationalists where they were strongest and instead focus on hitting them where they were weak. His forces, now known as the People's Liberation Army, PLA, engaged in guerrilla tactics, attacking isolated nationalist outposts, cutting supply lines, and ambushing enemy convoys. The countryside was Mao's domain, and he used it to his advantage, launching surprise attacks and then melting back into the landscape before the nationalists could retaliate. The support of the peasants was crucial to Mao's success. During the Japanese occupation, the Communists had gained the loyalty of the rural population through land reforms and by treating the people with respect. The nationalists, on the other hand, were often seen as corrupt and disconnected from the needs of the common people. This gave Mao a significant advantage. The peasants provided food, shelter, and intelligence to the communist forces, making it difficult for the nationalists to operate in the countryside. The Civil War raged on, and the tide began to turn in favor of the communists. Mao's forces, though initially outnumbered and outgunned, grew stronger with each passing day. More and more nationalist soldiers, disillusioned with their leadership, defected to the communist side. Mao's strategy of encircling the cities, cutting off their supplies, and isolating the nationalist forces slowly but surely began to pay off. By 1948, the Communists had gained the upper hand. They launched a series of major offensives, capturing key cities and strategic locations. The nationalist forces, demoralized and suffering from internal divisions, were unable to mount an effective defense. The once mighty nationalist army began to crumble under the relentless pressure of the communist advance. In the summer of 1949, the situation for the nationalists became dire. Mao's forces captured the vital city of Nanjing, the nationalist capital. This victory was a devastating blow to Chiang Kai-shek's government, and it marked the beginning of the end for the nationalists. One by one, the remaining nationalist strongholds fell to the communists. The PLA, now a formidable force, marched triumphantly across the country, bringing more and more territory under communist control. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong stood atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace in Beijing and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. The moment he had dreamed of for so many years had finally arrived. China was now under communist rule, and Mao was its leader. The Civil War was effectively over, and Chiang Kai-shek, along with his remaining forces, fled to the island of Taiwan, where he established a government in exile. The victory of the communists was more than just a military triumph. It was the culmination of years of struggle, sacrifice, and determination. Mao's vision of a new China, free from the control of warlords, imperial powers, and corrupt officials, had become a reality. But even as the celebrations erupted in the streets of Beijing, Mao knew that the real challenges were just beginning. The China that Mao now ruled was vast, diverse, and deeply scarred by decades of war and suffering. The economy was in ruins, infrastructure was destroyed, and millions of people were displaced. The task of rebuilding the country was enormous, and Mao was well aware that the revolution he had led was only the first step in a long and difficult process of nation-building. Mao's vision for China was clear. He wanted to transform the country into a socialist state, where the means of production were controlled by the people, and where wealth and power were distributed more equally. But achieving this vision would require radical changes, and Mao was determined to push forward, no matter the cost. In the years that followed, Mao launched a series of sweeping reforms aimed at restructuring Chinese society. Land reforms were expanded, with landowners being stripped of their property and the land redistributed to the peasants. The Communist Party took control of industry, banks, and commerce, bringing them under state ownership. Education and healthcare were prioritized, with efforts made to improve literacy and provide basic medical care to the population. But these changes were not without their challenges. The rapid pace of reform, combined with the lingering effects of the Civil War, led to widespread disruption and hardship. Many of the policies, particularly those aimed at collectivizing agriculture, faced resistance and resulted in unintended consequences, including food shortages and economic difficulties. Mao's leadership style also began to show its darker side. As he consolidated power, he became increasingly intolerant of dissent. The Communist Party, under Mao's guidance, implemented strict controls over political and social life. Those who were seen as opponents of the new regime were persecuted, imprisoned, or even executed. Mao believed that a strong, unified government was necessary to achieve his vision for China, but this came at the cost of individual freedoms and human rights. The victory of the Communists in the Civil War marked a turning point in Chinese history. It was the beginning of a new era, one that would see China transformed from a feudal society into a modern socialist state. Mao Zedong's role in this transformation was central. His leadership, his strategies, and his vision for China shaped the course of the nation's development. But the challenges that lay ahead were immense. Mao had won the war, but now he faced the even greater challenge of building a new China, a China that would live up to the ideals of the revolution. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with obstacles and difficult choices. Yet Mao was determined to move forward, to continue the struggle for a better, more just society. The Civil War had ended, but the revolution was far from over. Mao Zedong knew that the real test of his leadership was just beginning. The founding of the People's Republic of China was not the end of the story, but the start of a new chapter, one that would shape the future of China and its people for generations to come. Chapter 7. Building a New China. Mao Zedong stood at the helm of a nation in ruins. The China he had fought so hard to unify was devastated by years of war with Japan, civil war with the nationalists, and internal strife. The scars of conflict were everywhere. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure was destroyed, and millions of people were displaced, living in poverty and uncertainty. Famine stalked the land, and illiteracy was widespread. As the leader of the new People's Republic of China, Mao faced enormous challenges. But he was determined to transform China into a modern, industrialized socialist state, a nation that could stand proud and independent on the world stage. Mao's vision for China was ambitious. He saw the country not just as a political entity, but as a society that needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. This transformation, he believed, required radical changes in every aspect of life, economic, social, and cultural. The revolution was not over. In Mao's eyes, it was just beginning. One of Mao's first priorities was land reform. The vast majority of China's population were peasants who had suffered under the oppressive rule of landlords for centuries. Mao believed that the key to winning their loyalty and to building a strong foundation for the new China was to give them control over the land they worked. In the early 1950s, Mao launched a massive campaign to redistribute land from the landlords to the peasants. This was not a peaceful process. It often involved public trials and executions of landlords, as the Communist Party encouraged the peasants to rise up against their former oppressors. The land reform campaign was brutal, but it achieved its goal. Millions of peasants received land, and for the first time, they had a stake in the new China. This not only boosted agricultural production, but also solidified the Communist Party's support among the rural population. Mao saw this as a critical step in the creation of a socialist state, one where the people, not the elite, held the power. But land reform was just the beginning. Mao also wanted to transform China's economy from a largely agrarian one into a modern, industrialized powerhouse. To do this, he nationalized all major industries. Factories, mines, and banks were brought under state control. The government set ambitious targets for production, and resources were directed towards building infrastructure such as roads, railways, and power plants. These projects were designed to lay the groundwork for China's industrialization and to create jobs for millions of workers. The focus on heavy industry was central to Mao's vision. He believed that a strong industrial base was essential for China's independence and for its ability to defend itself against foreign threats. However, this rapid push for industrialization came at a cost. The emphasis on heavy industry often led to the neglect of agriculture, which caused food shortages and suffering in the countryside. Mao's vision for China went beyond economic reforms. He wanted to change Chinese society itself, to create a new kind of citizen who would be loyal to the Communist Party and committed to the ideals of socialism. He believed that this required a fundamental shift in the way people thought, lived, and worked. To achieve this, Mao launched a series of social and cultural campaigns aimed at reshaping Chinese society. Education was a key focus. Mao believed that every citizen needed to be literate and educated in the principles of Marxism-Leninism. Schools were established across the country, and efforts were made to teach reading and writing to both children and adults. The curriculum was designed not only to provide basic education, but also to instill loyalty to the Communist Party and its ideology. But Mao's efforts to reshape society did not stop at education. He also sought to change traditional Chinese culture, which he saw as backward and feudal. Confucian values, which had dominated Chinese society for centuries, were criticized and often attacked. The Communist Party promoted new cultural norms that emphasized collective over individual interests, loyalty to the state, and the rejection of old customs and practices. One of the most significant cultural campaigns during this period was the thought reform movement. Intellectuals, teachers, and students were encouraged, or sometimes forced, to engage in self-criticism and to study Marxist-Leninist theory. The goal was to align their thinking with the Communist Party's ideology and to eliminate any remnants of bourgeois or reactionary ideas. This movement was often harsh and coercive, leading to the persecution of those who were seen as resistant to change. Mao's desire to create a new society also extended to the organization of labor. He believed that collective labor, where people worked together for the common good, was the key to building socialism. This led to the formation of cooperatives and, eventually, communes, where people lived and worked together, sharing everything from tools to food. The communes were meant to be self-sufficient units that would increase productivity and promote socialist values. The establishment of communes was a radical change for many Chinese people, especially in rural areas. The traditional family structure, which had been the foundation of Chinese society for centuries, was disrupted as people were encouraged to put the collective above the individual. Life in the communes was often harsh, with long hours of labor and strict rules governing every aspect of daily life. While some embraced this new way of living, others found it difficult to adjust. Mao's efforts to transform China were not without resistance. Many of the changes he imposed were deeply unpopular, especially among those who had been privileged under the old system. Landlords, intellectuals, and traditional elites often found themselves targeted by the Communist Party's campaigns. But Mao was determined to push forward, believing that the success of the revolution depended on the complete transformation of Chinese society. As Mao worked to build a new China, he faced enormous challenges. The country's sheer size and diversity made it difficult to implement policies uniformly. Regional differences, language barriers, and local resistance all posed obstacles to Mao's vision. Additionally, the rapid pace of change led to significant social and economic disruptions, causing suffering and discontent among the population. Despite these challenges, Mao remained committed to his vision. He saw himself as the architect of a new China, a nation that would rise from the ashes of war and oppression to become a strong, independent, and socialist state. He believed that the sacrifices required to achieve this vision were necessary for the greater good of the country. By the late 1950s, Mao had achieved much of what he set out to do. China was on the path to industrialization. The Communist Party was firmly in control, and the old social order had been dismantled. But Mao was not satisfied. He believed that the revolution was an ongoing process, one that required constant vigilance and effort to maintain. The challenges of building a new China were far from over, and Mao was ready to continue the struggle to shape the nation according to his vision. The task of building a new China was immense, and Mao knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But he was determined to see it through, to create a country that could stand on its own, free from the oppression of the past. The revolution had brought Mao to power, but it was his vision for a new China that would define his legacy and the future of the nation. Chapter 8. The Great Leap Forward. In 1958, Mao Zedong launched one of the most ambitious and controversial campaigns in Chinese history. It was called the Great Leap Forward. Mao's vision was grand. He wanted to transform China from a largely agrarian society into a socialist powerhouse that could rival the industrialized nations of the West. The Great Leap Forward was supposed to be a bold step into the future, a way to rapidly modernize China's economy and society. But instead, it became a tragic chapter in China's history, marked by disaster, suffering, and loss. Mao believed that the key to achieving his vision was to mobilize the masses. He called for the creation of people's communes, large collective farms where thousands of families would live and work together, sharing everything from tools to food. The idea was that by pooling resources and labor, the communes could achieve much greater efficiency and productivity than individual farms. Mao wanted the communes to be self-sufficient, producing not just food, but also goods like clothing, furniture, and tools. But Mao's ambitions didn't stop at agriculture. He also wanted to rapidly industrialize the countryside. To achieve this, he called for the mass production of steel. Factories in the cities were already producing steel, but Mao wanted even the most remote villages to contribute. So, he encouraged peasants to build small backyard furnaces where they could melt down scrap metal to produce steel. Mao believed that if every village could produce steel, China's industrial output would skyrocket, bringing the country closer to his vision of a socialist utopia. The enthusiasm for the Great Leap Forward was immense. Across China, people threw themselves into the campaign with energy and determination. Villages were transformed as communes were established, and everywhere, peasants began building backyard furnaces. The government set high production targets, and local officials, eager to please Mao, often exaggerated their achievements. Reports of record-breaking harvests and steel production filled the airwaves and newspapers, creating a sense of optimism and excitement. But beneath the surface, things were not as they seemed. The reality of the Great Leap Forward was far from the ideal that Mao had envisioned. The creation of communes disrupted traditional farming practices, and in many cases, the land was poorly managed. Peasants, who had once been careful stewards of their small plots of land, now found themselves working in large, impersonal collectives where their efforts seemed less meaningful. The rush to meet production targets led to poor planning, and agricultural output began to suffer. Meanwhile, the push to produce steel in backyard furnaces had unintended consequences. Many of the furnaces were poorly constructed, and the steel they produced was often of low quality, unusable for building or manufacturing. Worse still, the effort to produce steel diverted labor away from the fields. In some areas, entire villages were focused on keeping the furnaces burning, leaving crops unharvested. As a result, food production plummeted, and a severe famine began to take hold. The famine that followed the Great Leap Forward was catastrophic. Millions of people across China were affected, and it's estimated that between 15 to 45 million people died from starvation or related causes. The scale of the disaster was unimaginable. In some areas, entire communities were wiped out, and the countryside was filled with suffering and despair. The famine was made worse by the government's refusal to acknowledge the crisis. Local officials, fearing punishment, continued to report inflated production figures, which led to even greater mismanagement and further exacerbated the food shortages. Mao's reputation, which had once been untouchable, began to suffer. The Great Leap Forward, intended to be a glorious step towards a new China, had instead brought about one of the worst man-made disasters in history. Within the Communist Party, there was growing criticism of Mao's policies, and some of his closest allies began to distance themselves from him. Mao himself was forced to step back from direct leadership for a time, as the party attempted to deal with the crisis. But despite the enormous failure of the Great Leap Forward, Mao did not give up on his dream of a new China. He believed that the principles behind the campaign were sound, even if the implementation had been flawed. Mao was convinced that the only way to build a truly socialist society was through mass mobilization and radical change, and he continued to push for these ideals even as the country struggled to recover from the famine. The aftermath of the Great Leap Forward was a time of reflection and reassessment for China. The government, under the leadership of more pragmatic officials, began to implement policies to address the famine and stabilize the economy. Agricultural production slowly began to recover, and the communes were restructured to give farmers more control over their land and resources. The emphasis on backyard steel production was abandoned, and efforts were made to rebuild the economy in a more sustainable way. For Mao, the lessons of the Great Leap Forward were complex. On one hand, he recognized that mistakes had been made, mistakes that had caused immense suffering. On the other hand, he remained committed to the idea that China's future lay in the hands of the masses and that revolutionary change was necessary to achieve true socialism. This belief would continue to drive his actions in the years to come as he sought new ways to transform Chinese society. The Great Leap Forward was a turning point in Mao's leadership and in the history of China. It exposed the dangers of unchecked ambition and the consequences of policies that ignored the realities of life on the ground. The campaign left deep scars on the Chinese people and on the Communist Party itself, and it would take years for the country to fully recover. But for Mao Zedong, the failure of the Great Leap Forward did not mark the end of his revolutionary vision. He remained determined to build a new China, a China that would stand as a model of socialism and independence. The Great Leap Forward had shown that the path to this vision was fraught with dangers, but Mao was not one to shy away from challenges. He believed that the revolution was a continuous process, one that required constant vigilance and struggle. As China moved forward, the memory of the Great Leap Forward would remain a powerful reminder of the complexities of leadership, the importance of listening to the people, and the need for careful planning in the pursuit of ambitious goals. Mao's dream of transforming China had led to great suffering, but it had also sparked a debate about the best way to achieve progress, a debate that would shape the future of China for decades to come. The Great Leap Forward was over, but Mao's journey was far from finished. He would continue to seek ways to push China towards his vision, always believing that the next great leap was just around the corner. But the lessons of this period would cast a long shadow over the country, influencing the decisions of leaders and the lives of ordinary people for generations to come. Chapter 9. The Cultural Revolution. In 1966, Mao Zedong unleashed a campaign that would forever change the face of China. This campaign, known as the Cultural Revolution, was one of the most tumultuous and controversial periods in modern Chinese history. Mao, now in his early 70s, believed that the Communist Party was losing its revolutionary fervor. He feared that the party was becoming too conservative, too bureaucratic, and too distant from the ideals that had driven the Chinese Revolution. In Mao's eyes, the revolution was not just a historical event. It was an ongoing process, one that required constant vigilance and renewal. Mao saw danger in the growing influence of what he called the capitalist rotors within the party, those who, in his view, were steering China away from its socialist path. To prevent this, Mao called for a radical movement to purify the party and the nation. He believed that the youth of China were the key to this movement. Young people, he thought, were free from the corruption of the old order and could be the driving force behind a new wave of revolutionary change. The Cultural Revolution began with a call to the youth to rise up and destroy the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. Mao encouraged students to challenge authority, to question their teachers, and to reject the values of the past. Schools were closed, and young people flooded into the streets, eager to prove their revolutionary zeal. These young revolutionaries became known as the Red Guards, and they quickly became a powerful force across the country. The Red Guards were enthusiastic and full of energy. They saw themselves as the vanguard of a new revolution, tasked with rooting out the enemies of socialism wherever they were found. With Mao's encouragement, they began attacking anyone they believed was opposed to the revolutionary cause. Intellectuals, teachers, artists, and even government officials were targeted. Public humiliations, beatings, and even killings became common as the Red Guards sought to rid China of anyone associated with the old ways. Traditional Chinese culture, with its rich history of Confucian values, literature, and art, was a prime target of the Red Guards. Temples, ancient texts, and cultural artifacts were destroyed in a wave of fervor. The Red Guards saw these remnants of the past as symbols of oppression and backwardness, and they were determined to wipe them out. The Cultural Revolution sought to erase the old and replace it with a new revolutionary culture that was loyal to Mao and the Communist Party. But the Cultural Revolution quickly spiraled out of control. What began as a movement to reinvigorate the revolutionary spirit soon descended into chaos. Rival factions of Red Guards began fighting each other, each claiming to be the true defenders of Mao's vision. The violence escalated, and the social fabric of China began to unravel. Schools and universities remained closed, factories were disrupted, and transportation systems broke down. The economy, already fragile, suffered greatly as the country was gripped by turmoil. Families were torn apart as the Cultural Revolution demanded absolute loyalty to Mao and the party. Children were encouraged to denounce their parents if they were suspected of harboring counter-revolutionary ideas. Long-standing friendships and community bonds were destroyed as people turned on each other, driven by fear and suspicion. The sense of unity and purpose that had once held the nation together was shattered, replaced by a climate of fear and uncertainty. Mao Zedong, however, saw the Cultural Revolution as a necessary and even positive development. He believed that the chaos was a sign that the revolution was alive and that the enemies of socialism were being exposed. Mao's own position was secure. He was revered as the great helmsman, the leader who had guided China through the revolution and into the modern era. The Red Guards worshipped him, carrying his little red book of quotes and pledging their loyalty to his vision. But as the years passed, the damage caused by the Cultural Revolution became impossible to ignore. The economy was in shambles, educational institutions were in ruins, and millions of lives had been destroyed. Even some of Mao's closest allies began to question the wisdom of the campaign. By the late 1960s, Mao himself recognized that the Cultural Revolution had gone too far, and he began to take steps to bring it under control. In 1969, Mao called for the disbanding of the Red Guards, and the military was brought in to restore order. The chaos gradually subsided, but the scars left by the Cultural Revolution would take years to heal. Schools and universities slowly reopened, but the damage to China's intellectual and cultural life was profound. Many of the brightest minds of a generation had been persecuted or silenced, and the cultural heritage of China had been severely damaged. The Cultural Revolution officially ended in 1976, the same year that Mao Zedong died. As China began to emerge from the shadow of this turbulent period, the country's new leaders faced the daunting task of rebuilding a nation that had been torn apart by a decade of ideological fervor. The legacy of the Cultural Revolution was complex and deeply controversial. For some, it was a time of revolutionary purity, a necessary cleansing of the old to make way for the new. For others, it was a period of unnecessary suffering, a time when China lost its way in the pursuit of a utopian dream. Mao's role in the Cultural Revolution has been the subject of much debate. To his supporters, he was a visionary leader who was willing to take bold steps to preserve the revolution. To his critics, he was a tyrant whose actions led to the suffering and death of millions. What is clear, however, is that the Cultural Revolution had a profound impact on China and its people. It was a time of great upheaval, one that left a lasting mark on the nation's history. As China moved forward, the lessons of the Cultural Revolution would not be forgotten. The experience showed the dangers of unchecked power, the perils of ideological extremism, and the importance of stability in governance. In the years that followed, China's leaders would take a more pragmatic approach to economic and social policy, seeking to avoid the mistakes of the past. The Cultural Revolution was a defining moment in Mao Zedong's life and in the history of China. It was a time of great passion and great tragedy, a time when the ideals of the revolution were pushed to their limits. For Mao, it was the last great battle of his revolutionary career, a battle to keep the flame of the revolution burning, even at the cost of great suffering. As China looked to the future, the memory of the Cultural Revolution served as a powerful reminder of the complexities of revolution and the challenges of building a new society. Mao Zedong's dream of a revolutionary China had led the country through many trials. The Cultural Revolution was perhaps the most difficult of all. But through it all, Mao remained committed to his vision, believing that only through struggle could China achieve its destiny. The Cultural Revolution was over, but its impact would be felt for generations to come, shaping the future of China and the world. Chapter 10. The End of an Era. By the early 1970s, Mao Zedong, the man who had led China through revolution and upheaval, was aging. His health was declining, and the once energetic leader was now frail and often bedridden. Mao had dedicated his life to transforming China, but the years of struggle had taken their toll. The Cultural Revolution, his last great campaign, had left the country divided, its people weary and its economy weakened. Yet, despite these challenges, Mao remained a towering figure in Chinese politics, a symbol of the revolution, the great helmsman, who had steered China through its most turbulent times. Mao's influence on China was undeniable. He had reshaped the nation, leading it from the chaos of civil war to the establishment of the People's Republic. His policies, though controversial and often harsh, had set China on a path of radical change. But by the 1970s, it was clear that the country needed a new direction, one that could heal the wounds of the Cultural Revolution and guide China into a more stable and prosperous future. In 1972, Mao made a surprising and historic move that would change China's relationship with the world. He agreed to meet with U.S. President Richard Nixon. This was an extraordinary event. China and the United States had been bitter enemies for decades, and the idea of the two leaders sitting down together seemed almost unthinkable. But Mao, ever the strategist, recognized that the world was changing, and that China could not remain isolated if it wanted to grow and succeed. The meeting between Mao and Nixon was a turning point. It marked the beginning of a new relationship between China and the West. For years, China had been cut off from much of the world, pursuing its own path of socialism and revolution. But by opening the door to dialogue with the United States, Mao signaled that China was ready to engage with the global community on its own terms. The meeting was carefully orchestrated, with both sides aware of its significance. For China, it was an opportunity to break out of its isolation and to seek new opportunities for trade and development. The impact of this meeting was profound. It led to a gradual thawing of relations between China and the West, paving the way for future diplomatic and economic ties. For Mao, it was a moment of triumph. He had managed to bring China onto the world stage in a way that few could have imagined, but it also marked a shift in his role within the country. While Mao was still respected as the leader of the revolution, it was becoming clear that the future of China would be shaped by new leaders with different ideas. As the 1970s progressed, Mao's health continued to decline, and his influence began to wane. Other leaders within the Communist Party, such as Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping, started to take more control over the direction of the country. These leaders recognized the need for economic reform and greater openness to the world, and they began to implement policies that would set China on a new course. Mao, though still revered, played a less active role in day-to-day governance. But Mao's presence loomed large. He remained the symbolic leader of the nation, the figurehead of the Communist Party, and the embodiment of the revolutionary spirit that had shaped modern China. To many, he was still the great helmsman, the man who had guided China through its most difficult challenges. His portrait hung over Tiananmen Square, and his words were quoted by millions. Even as his power diminished, Mao's legacy was deeply ingrained in the fabric of Chinese society. In his final years, Mao reflected on the achievements and failures of his leadership. He had seen China rise from the ashes of war and colonialism to become a unified, independent nation. But he had also witnessed the suffering caused by his policies, the famine of the Great Leap Forward, the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. Mao remained convinced that the revolution had been necessary, that the sacrifices made were for the greater good. But there were also moments of doubt, moments when he questioned whether the cost had been too high. Mao's death on September 9, 1976, marked the end of an era. The news of his passing sent shockwaves through China. Millions mourned the loss of the man who had led them through revolution, who had promised to build a new China. His funeral was a massive event, attended by leaders from around the world, and millions of Chinese citizens paid their respects. For many, Mao's death was not just the passing of a leader, but the end of a chapter in Chinese history. With Mao's death, China stood at a crossroads. The country he had built was powerful, but also deeply scarred. The new leaders who took over faced the daunting task of rebuilding and reforming a nation that had been through decades of turmoil. Deng Xiaoping, who would emerge as Mao's successor, recognized that China needed to move away from the ideological battles of the past and focus on economic development. Under Deng's leadership, China would embark on a path of reform and opening up, setting the stage for the country's transformation into a global economic power. Mao's legacy remains complex and contested. He is remembered as the founder of modern China, a leader who united the country and stood up to foreign powers. But he is also remembered for the suffering caused by his policies, for the millions who died during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. In China, Mao is still revered as a great leader, but his legacy is also a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the costs of ideological extremism. The era of Mao Zedong was over, but its impact would be felt for generations. The China that Mao had envisioned, a socialist state, independent and strong, had been realized, but not without great sacrifice. The challenges that Mao faced and the decisions he made would continue to shape the future of China and its people. As the country moved forward, it would carry with it the lessons of Mao's era, lessons about leadership, revolution, and the complex journey of building a new nation. The story of Mao Zedong is the story of modern China, a story of struggle, ambition, and transformation. It is a story of a man who dedicated his life to his vision of a new China, a vision that brought both hope and hardship. Mao's era has ended, but the questions it raised about power, progress, and the price of revolution remain as relevant as ever. As China continues to evolve, the legacy of Mao Zedong will continue to be a defining part of its history, a reminder of the challenges and triumphs of the past, and a guide to the possibilities of the future. Chapter 11. Mao's Death and Legacy. On September 9, 1976, the life of Mao Zedong came to an end. He was 82 years old, and his death marked the closing chapter of a monumental era in Chinese history. For many in China, Mao's passing was a moment of profound grief. He had been the leader who had guided them through revolution, war, and the founding of a new nation. Mao was more than just a political figure. He was a symbol of the Chinese people's struggle for independence and their hopes for a better future. Mao's death was announced with a mix of sorrow and solemnity. Across China, people gathered to mourn the loss of the man who had shaped their lives and their country. His portrait, which hung over Tiananmen Square, was draped in black, and memorial services were held in cities and villages throughout the nation. For days, the country was enveloped in a collective sense of loss. But even as the people mourned, there was an awareness that China was already beginning to change, that the era of Mao was giving way to something new. Mao Zedong's legacy is one of the most complex and controversial in modern history. He is remembered as the founder of modern China, the leader who unified a fragmented and war-torn nation and brought it onto the world stage. Under his leadership, China transformed from a country dominated by warlords and foreign powers into a unified socialist state, with a central government that controlled the vast territory and diverse population of China. Mao's achievements are significant. He played a central role in the defeat of the nationalists during the Chinese Civil War, leading the Communist Party to victory in 1949. The founding of the People's Republic of China was a turning point, not only for China, but for the world. Mao's China became a major player on the global stage, particularly during the Cold War, as it navigated complex relationships with both the Soviet Union and the United States. However, Mao's legacy is also deeply marred by the suffering his policies caused. The Great Leap Forward, launched in the late 1950s, was Mao's ambitious attempt to rapidly industrialize China and transform it into a socialist powerhouse. But the campaign was a disaster. Poor planning, unrealistic production targets, and a focus on steel production at the expense of agriculture led to one of the deadliest famines in history. It is estimated that between 15 to 45 million people died as a result of the famine and related hardships. The Great Leap Forward left deep scars on Chinese society and damaged Mao's reputation, even within the Communist Party. Then came the Cultural Revolution, which Mao launched in 1966 to reassert his control and revive the revolutionary spirit of the Chinese people. The Cultural Revolution was marked by widespread persecution, violence, and social upheaval. Mao called on the youth to rise up and attack the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. Schools were closed, intellectuals were persecuted, and traditional culture was attacked. The Red Guards, groups of radical students, roamed the streets, targeting anyone they believed was an enemy of the revolution. The Cultural Revolution plunged China into chaos. Families were torn apart, millions of people were persecuted, and the country's cultural heritage was severely damaged. The economy suffered, and the educational system was disrupted for a decade. Although Mao believed that the Cultural Revolution was necessary to keep the revolutionary spirit alive, the campaign caused immense suffering and left a lasting impact on Chinese society. Today, Mao Zedong is both revered and criticized in China. He is celebrated as the leader who brought unity and independence to the country, but he is also remembered as the architect of policies that led to widespread suffering. Mao's image still looms large in China. His portrait hangs over Tiananmen Square, and his face is on the country's currency. For many Chinese, Mao is a symbol of national pride and the struggles that led to the creation of modern China. But Mao's legacy is also a subject of debate and reflection. The Communist Party acknowledges both his contributions and his mistakes. Officially, Mao is credited with having been 70% right and 30% wrong, a formula that reflects the complexity of his legacy. This assessment allows the party to honor Mao's role in the founding of the People's Republic, while also recognizing the catastrophic consequences of some of his policies. The impact of Mao's policies is still felt in China today. The famine caused by the Great Leap Forward and the chaos of the Cultural Revolution left deep scars on the Chinese people. These events have influenced the decisions of subsequent Chinese leaders, who have been more cautious in implementing sweeping changes. The reforms that followed Mao's death, particularly those led by Deng Xiaoping, marked a significant departure from Mao's policies. Deng introduced economic reforms that opened China to the world and set the country on a path to becoming a global economic powerhouse. Mao's death also marked the end of an era in Chinese politics. His leadership style was characterized by personal rule, ideological campaigns, and a focus on revolutionary purity. After Mao, China's leaders shifted towards collective leadership, economic pragmatism, and a more stable approach to governance. The transition from Mao's era to the era of reform and opening up was not just a change in policy, but a transformation in the way China was governed. As China has continued to grow and evolve, Mao's legacy remains a powerful force. He is remembered as the man who led China through its most challenging period of transformation, a leader who was both visionary and flawed. For many, Mao represents the struggle for a new China, a China free from the control of foreign powers, a China where the people have the power to shape their own destiny. But Mao's legacy is also a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the consequences of ideological extremism. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution serve as cautionary tales, illustrating how the pursuit of a utopian vision can lead to disaster when it ignores the realities of life on the ground. These events have left a lasting impact on Chinese society, shaping the way the country approaches change and governance. As China moves forward, the legacy of Mao Zedong continues to influence its path. The questions raised by Mao's life and policies about leadership, revolution, and the role of the state in society remain relevant as China navigates its place in the world. Mao's era may have ended, but the lessons of his leadership continue to resonate, shaping the future of China and its people. Mao Zedong's death was not just the end of a life, but the end of an era. His legacy is complex, marked by both remarkable achievements and devastating failures. As China looks to the future, it does so with an awareness of the past, carrying with it the lessons of Mao's era and the enduring impact of his vision for a new China. Chapter 12. The Historical Impact. Mao Zedong's life and actions profoundly shaped the course of Chinese history. When he rose to power in 1949, China was a country ravaged by decades of war, foreign domination, and internal strife. It was a land of deep poverty, fractured by competing warlords and suffering under the weight of colonial exploitation. Mao transformed this fragmented, war-torn country into a unified communist state. He forged a new identity for China, one rooted in socialism, independence, and revolutionary fervor. But Mao's influence did not end with his death. It continues to resonate in China and around the world, even decades later. Mao's most enduring legacy in China is the establishment of the People's Republic, a nation that has stood the test of time. Under his leadership, China was able to rid itself of foreign domination and achieve a degree of unity and stability that it had not seen for centuries. He laid the foundation for a centralized government that could wield authority across the vast and diverse regions of China, ensuring that the nation could act as a single entity on the global stage. This sense of unity was a remarkable achievement, given the deep divisions that had existed in China before the revolution. Mao's ideas, often referred to as Maoism, continue to influence China's politics and society. His emphasis on self-reliance, class struggle, and the importance of the peasantry in revolution shaped the policies of the Communist Party for decades. Even today, Mao's image is invoked by those within the party who advocate for the preservation of socialist principles and the rejection of capitalist influences. His portrait still hangs over Tiananmen Square, a reminder of the role he played in shaping the nation. But Mao's impact extends far beyond the borders of China. His revolutionary ideas inspired movements around the world, from Asia to Africa to Latin America. In the mid-20th century, many colonized and oppressed peoples looked to Mao's success in China as a model for their own struggles for independence and social justice. Mao's writings on guerrilla warfare and revolutionary strategy became essential reading for revolutionary leaders across the globe. They saw in Mao a champion of the oppressed, someone who had successfully led a revolution against both foreign imperialists and domestic elites. In Vietnam, for example, the revolutionary leader Ho Chi Minh was deeply influenced by Mao's ideas. The Vietnamese communists adopted many of Mao's strategies in their fight against French colonial rule and later against the United States. In Latin America, leaders like Fidel Castro in Cuba and the revolutionary Che Guevara were inspired by Mao's emphasis on the importance of rural peasants in revolutionary movements. Across Africa, Maoism influenced various anti-colonial struggles as people sought to throw off the yoke of European imperialism and create new independent nations. However, Mao's legacy is not without its darker aspects. While some saw him as a champion of the oppressed, others viewed him as a tyrant whose policies caused untold suffering. The Great Leap Forward, intended to rapidly industrialize China, led to one of the worst famines in human history, with millions of people dying as a result. The Cultural Revolution, launched to preserve the revolutionary spirit, plunged China into chaos, leading to widespread persecution, the destruction of cultural heritage, and the loss of countless lives. The impact of these events left deep scars on Chinese society. Families were torn apart, intellectuals were silenced, and the economy was severely disrupted. The trauma of these experiences still lingers in China, influencing the way the country approaches governance and reform. The Chinese government today is cautious about implementing sweeping changes, mindful of the dangers of repeating the mistakes of the past. Mao's legacy, therefore, is a complex and contested one. In China, he is revered as the father of the nation, a leader who brought unity and independence. But he is also criticized for the suffering caused by his policies. The official position of the Chinese government is that Mao was 70% right and 30% wrong, a formula that reflects both the admiration for his achievements and the recognition of his failures. Outside of China, Mao's legacy is equally complex. In some parts of the world, he is celebrated as a symbol of anti-imperialism and revolutionary struggle. In others, he is remembered as a dictator who imposed a harsh and repressive regime. The global perception of Mao varies widely, depending on historical context and political perspective. Mao's story is a story of ambition, struggle, and the complex consequences of revolution. He was a leader who pursued his vision for China with unwavering determination, but whose methods often led to unforeseen and tragic outcomes. His life is a testament to the power of ideas, the power to inspire, to mobilize, and to transform a nation. But it also serves as a reminder of the responsibilities that come with wielding such power. The decisions Mao made had profound and lasting effects on millions of lives, for better and for worse. As we reflect on Mao's life, we are reminded that history is never simple. It is full of triumphs and tragedies, of dreams realized and dreams shattered. Mao Zedong's legacy encapsulates this complexity. He was a leader who achieved great things, but at a tremendous cost. His vision for a new China was realized, but the path to that vision was fraught with suffering and hardship. Mao's influence continues to shape the world today. In China, his legacy is still a source of debate and reflection, influencing the way the country thinks about its past and its future. Internationally, Mao's ideas continue to be studied and discussed by those who seek to understand the dynamics of revolution and the challenges of building a new society. The story of Mao Zedong is not just the story of one man. It is the story of a nation's struggle to define itself in the modern world. It is the story of the challenges and complexities of revolution, of the power and the pitfalls of ideological commitment. As we look back on Mao's life and legacy, we see a figure who was both a hero and a villain, a visionary and a tyrant. His life serves as a powerful reminder of the impact that one individual can have on the course of history, for better or for worse. Mao Zedong's legacy is, in many ways, a mirror of the 20th century itself, a century marked by both extraordinary progress and devastating conflict. As we move further into the 21st century, the lessons of Mao's life and the history he helped shape will continue to resonate, offering insights into the complexities of leadership, the consequences of revolution, and the ongoing struggle to build a better world.